overwhelming sense of loss, but just, and it's not that he can't do the job, it's the size of the job and the responsibilities and the things that will be coming at him about the monarchy and, you know, other issues that have to be dealt with by the royal family. And he knows that the world is kind of watching how he's going to handle all this. So I'm sure he's needs a little time to start thinking through a few of his new duties and roles and how he will fulfill that, and who he will surround himself with will be key. You know, who the advisors are, who the other leaders around the world that he listens to. Because, you know, in that larger circle of leaders and prime ministers and presidents and kings and queens, they talk. They talk about issues, and some of them form great and solid friendships from that and guide each other. And King Charles will already have a certain network, but it just got a lot bigger.
And as we watch the Queen's coffin being carried, the procession moving through Westminster Abbey, her children and grandchildren right behind it, the imperial state crown and the orb still on the casket. It will move out and be put back on the gun carriage. And Brian, that is a gun carriage that has transported, I think I read, going back to Queen Victoria. It has such a connection to her family.
And Queen Victoria. Gun carriage is a little later than that, dating from the First World War, but it was originally would have carried an actual operational artillery piece, and that's been removed, and the carriage has been modified to hold the casket, and that same carriage has been used, as you say, for years, certainly for Winston Churchill's funeral, for example, and it's preserved and made ready for occasions such as this.
People with their heads bowed as the coffin goes past them. The invited guests from Canada are there as well. The Prime Minister and his wife, former Prime Ministers, former Governors General, leaders of the First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities in Canada, all witness to this. And as they move towards the door of Westminster Abbey, they will emerge in what has turned into a beautifully sunny day here.
Lovely. I mean, it's actually been a great week of weather during this whole time for the Queen, even lying in state. The only night it really rained is when she came home to Buckingham Palace in the hearse. That's when it was raining. But it's as if the skies have kind of opened up for her today.
There was an iconic shot of the rainbow that emerged just after her death over Windsor Castle. Pretty moving.
Very moving.
Now those 8 pallbearers have the task of replacing the coffin onto the gun carriage, and this will be the start of, you could call it the second phase of what we're going to see today. This will be a procession from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch, which is at Hyde Park Corner, if you know London, and we'll head down the Mall, go around in front of Buckingham Palace, and then to Hyde Park Corner. And that will take about 45 minutes, because they will be walking.
And it's significant. There's 2 important landmarks to Canadians on the way. There's the Commonwealth Arch, and they'll pass through that. But also in Green Park, there is a memorial to all of the fallen Canadian soldiers from the World Wars. It's a beautiful monument that's low to the ground, but it's full of maple leaves. So it's pretty special, so it's important that the Queen will be passing past that memorial.
And when you think of it, passing past her home, Buckingham Palace, you know, for the last time, I mean, we look at it as this iconic building that represents so much to us, but it was her home, right? She did have a few, but I mean, this one is where most of their major, you know, meetings would have taken place, and all those balcony scenes.
And I guess it's not absolutely clear whether King Charles will live in Buckingham Palace. He lives in Clarence House now, of course, and he apparently likes it there. Nobody really loves living in Buckingham Palace, even though it's called a palace. It's being modernized now and renovated, but it's
It's
this.
got a lot of long hallways in it and
Yes.
drafty, and it doesn't necessarily feel, there's no center in it like there's a home, whereas some of the other palaces are built more conducive to a family living in it. And Clarence House is quite lovely. Now, I haven't been in it for 30 years, but the Queen Mother lived there. She adored that house. So what I don't think he has, I think the king can choose where he'd like to make his official residence, because originally it was St. James's Palace, and it was Queen Victoria and then Queen Elizabeth that kind of went to Buckingham Palace. So they have some say.
I don't think she wanted to live at Buckingham Palace either, but Winston Churchill thought it would be a good idea. So now,
For symbolism.
for symbolism, absolutely.
I think she's always felt most at home at Windsor, you know, so that's kind of her home, which of course they had the terrible fire there, and she recovered from that. So,
And that's where she will be laid to rest later this afternoon. The pallbearers have now placed the coffin onto the gun carriage. Gun carriage that carried her father, her grandfather, her great-grandfather, and her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. And it is being pulled. For those of you just joining us who didn't see the procession into Westminster Abbey, Brian McDonald, our military historian, can you explain why, what we're seeing here and why we're seeing the gun carriage pulled by people in naval uniform?
so these are all ratings from the Royal Navy sailors.
Ratings is a naval term.
A term for sailors in the Royal Navy, and you know, so over 100 of them here pulling the royal carriage. This is a tradition that started in 1901 with Queen Victoria's funeral. Traditionally, a gun carriage like this would be pulled by horses, but on that occasion it was bad weather, and so the horses were slipping a bit. So the decision was made to ensure that the carriage would be safe, and so it was given to the Royal Navy to pull it. And they've continued that tradition ever since. So well over 100 years now, and as you say, a number of monarchs that have served this tradition. And it's high pressure. You know, we have a team of sailors pulling it. We also have a team at the back braking it because it's a heavy carriage, and it's important to make sure it's under control the whole time. And you'll see, you know, that there's Royal Naval ratings in those what they call square rig with very distinctive naval uniforms. They're also joined by officers of the Royal Navy, and you'll see them carrying their swords in the reversed arms position. Very uncomfortable, but a mark of respect for the monarch. The Royal Navy, of course, here is the senior service. The King is wearing a naval uniform, as is the Princess Royal today.
And the band has begun to play. The procession has started off for the 45-minute walk to Wellington Arch at Hyde Park Corner. And we know that there will be thousands and thousands of people lining this route. One more chance for people who have really made a pilgrimage to this city to be part of this.
People from all over the world. I've been walking around London and into Green Park where you couldn't move yesterday. There were so many flowers, so many people, and they just kept coming. You could barely walk on the streets. They were so packed and so jammed, and people literally crying as they were walking in with their flowers into Green Park. So that was quite moving. Just small children as well. And people coming for various reasons, whether it reminds them of a loved mother or father that they had, so it's a funeral, or she impacted them some way through charity work or through her public service or through community and through COVID, you know, and veterans that are, you know, still have quite an emotional feeling about Her Majesty. And then others, I'm sure, were just curious and coming to see what it was all about and what was going on.
And we should say that marching behind the coffin in this procession once again are the Queen's children and grandchildren. as they make this slow march, as we mentioned, so many people, you can see them lining the route there, just as Horse Guards parade. Jeff Semple is in the crowd. I believe he is in Trafalgar Square area. Jeff.
Well, Donna, we're here on the streets in central London, and just take a look at this crowd. Thousands of people, as far as the eye can see here, and they just keep coming. I mean, the crowd is growing every single minute, and some of them, I have to say, are arriving a little bit disappointed. Much has been made about the security operation that was involved going into this unprecedented event. You see the police officers here, they are everywhere, and this crowd, this is about as close as they're allowed to get to the actual funeral procession route, which is down the street there. That is the Mall. It is, as you can see, a couple hundred meters away. So, at best, some of these people here are going to catch a fleeting glimpse of the coffin as it goes by. Most of them say they're just hoping to hear the procession as it comes by. So, yeah, the security here really intense, and the crowds, for the most part, not able to get anywhere close to where that procession is happening. Despite all of that, though, the mood here, I have to say, is pretty upbeat. We're here with Dilys, who we were chatting with earlier. Good morning, Dilys. So, how would you describe the feeling out here?
Oh, total sense of community. I came here on my own to start off with. Was on the train. Dean was sitting in the seat next to me on the train, coming down from Leicestershire. We started talking. Shall we walk down to the... Yeah, let's walk down. Initially, we thought we were going to separate, but then everywhere was full, so we said, oh, we'll just keep on walking, and we ended up here. Never having met each other before. Ever. Then, don't know, still don't know your name, but we've been chatting.
Yeah, Dean.
So, these people, and then the gentleman here, the binoculars. Yeah, he used to binoculars. So, it's making that connection with people because we're all here for the same reason. Often when you come to London, you walk along the streets and people avoid looking at you. Eye contact doesn't happen. Here, eye contact's everywhere. Oh, what are you doing? Oh, you know, and it's just amazing that because we're all here for the same reason, it's a moment of history that most of us will never ever see again, but it's also, we're all here to pay respect to a dearly loved Queen. So it's quite special, because it's got that wonderful feeling, and when the 2-minute silence was called, everybody went quiet, just as if you were in that abbey at the funeral, which is what you do when you go to a funeral. So, quite mind-blowing, really. Special.
Very special. Dilys, thank you so much for that. And, you know, Donna, we've heard that quite a lot. I have to say, you know, I lived here in London for about 6 years, and she's right. Londoners don't have a reputation for necessarily being overly friendly in the way that perhaps Canadians or Americans are, but today, you know, people are here. Many of them came by themselves, like Dilys. There is a real sense of warmth, a real sense of community, because as she said, people have come here for the same reason. She's the only monarch most of them have ever known, and they have come to say goodbye, come to say pay their respects, hoping to catch a glimpse, but just wanting to be here together. Back to you.
All right, Jeff Semple, thank you. With me here, overlooking Westminster Abbey, where the procession just left, is Bonnie Brownlee, royal commentator, and Brian McDonald, military historian. And, well, Jeff, oh, there we are. Well, Jeff was speaking, and there they are again. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police leading this procession. That is quite an honor, isn't it, Brian?
It really is. I think it's unprecedented to have a police force leading a procession like this, but of course, the RCMP has an incredible connection to the Queen. She was actually the longest serving member of the RCMP. And members of the RCMP, of course, during her state visits to Canada, they would be part of the ceremonial procession, but also officers in her close protection detail would guard her personally. So she developed a deep connection with them over the years. And the RCMP gifted a number of horses to the royal family, some of which are being ridden by the RCMP today. And one famously was her horse Burmese, which she rode for 18 different parades, trooping of the colour for her birthday, and that the horse is now buried on the grounds of Windsor Castle. So a deep connection to that horse from the RCMP to the Queen.
And they would have practiced for this, I'm sure, when they were told that this was going to be their role, so central. It must have been a little nerve-wracking.
Well, luckily they're members of the musical ride, so they're trained equestrians. But yeah, it would have been quite something to come over here, you can imagine, in not very much time, and then be tasked to lead the parade. It's a very high-profile job. And it's interesting, those horses are all marked on their hindquarters with a maple leaf that's brushed into the horsehair. We've seen a number of Canadians on parade here during this footage. I think the camera will probably go back to them, but there's a Canadian contingent that's mixed in with the Commonwealth contingent. So that's troops from across Canada and also Australians and New Zealanders. And then there's the honorary colonels of a number of the regiments of which the Queen was colonel-in-chief, and so they are represented here as well. So we've got a good Canadian presence here on parade. It's worth noting that the bearskin caps worn by the foot guards are actually Canadian bear. Yeah.
Good point. I still don't know how they managed to see when they're walking with those on, but yes. And the point of this procession is exactly what we saw there. It's for people to witness this, isn't it? To be present. They could have finished the funeral at Westminster Abbey and driven straight to Windsor Castle in a hearse quickly, but this is a moment for the thousands of people who have turned out to again bear witness, to be present, to be part of this.
That's right, and the hearse from Wellington Arch to Windsor is actually taking the long way. They're not going on the highway, they're deliberately going through smaller roads that people can stand by the road. My friends in Chiswick will be on the street corner watching them go by.
And that is part of the continuity here, isn't it, Bonnie? That the Queen is dead, the King is now in charge, and through his grief and the whole family, he needs to still be seen. And he and other members of the royal family immediately did that, including going on walkabouts and greeting people and being seen and not just shutting themselves away and mourning. And there's a reason for that.
Oh, for sure, and they've been very accessible during the past 10, 12 days. Some of it would have been planned, some of it not, just instantaneous. Let's go into the crowd, let's go and see some people where the flowers are at Windsor, and, which I think they've done, quite smartly, and I think that will serve them well as time goes on. But it's humanized them a bit too. It's allowed people to be quite close to them, especially in Scotland. And the streets were so narrow, but people could almost reach out and touch them. So I think that has helped them a lot to just be more real, and to see them in their grief makes them actually the same as us. So I think that should be helpful to them, moving forward, and exposing the grandchildren as they did at the vigil, and then the younger great-grandchildren that are there as well. I think for the first time ever, we're really seeing them as the family that they are, who they are. And the Queen had 4 children, they each had 2, there's 8 grandchildren, and now we've gotten to see them all together.
And there you can see Prince Harry, Prince Andrew, Prince William, the King, of course, King Charles, marching again. And this is a long, long day for them. They began marching behind the coffin when it left Westminster Hall this morning, through the whole service, walking again. It's an endurance test, but it's also important for the continuity of the monarchy, right?
It really is.
It's symbolic.
Absolutely, and there's this is dripping in symbolism. Everything has got meaning. And to your point about an endurance test, speaking to some of the Canadians that are on parade today, they've been practicing all week, and they would have formed up very early this morning, waiting for this moment. And they commented on the slow march. It's a very respectful, methodical march, but it's very difficult. It's a long way to march, but it's also a lot harder when you're walking that slowly. and they certainly felt that. They were feeling it physically, but they were thrilled with the reception they received here. All the Canadians and the Commonwealth troops were really brought in inside the Circle of Trust and were made a prominent part of this, and we'll see that here today, leading with the RCP, but also with the Canadian contingent.
And it's almost trance-like when you're watching it. There's something, I think you go into a out-of-body experience when you're marching that slow march, even for the family members, right? And it just sort of takes you to the emotion of all of it just by watching the beauty of the parade.
The steady beat of the drum.
And that casket's now passing the Cenotaph courses, which is the National War Memorial here, where Remembrance Sunday is conducted every year. Pretty poignant moment.
They've also included what they call the second Earl of Snowdon, but the Queen's nephew, her sister's son, so which is kind of nice that they,
Because saluting. I guess they're saluting because of the
Saluting the
cenotaph.
That's right.
Yes.
Showing their respect for the fallen.
We had been told earlier today, actually late last night, that Prince George and Princess Charlotte would march too. They are not here for this part. This would be too much for them.
We may see something of them at Windsor, but not, that's almost 3 miles, that march. So, yeah, I think that's too much for them at this age, but they'll be in the car.
But that would be 3 generations of the Queen's family represented.
Yeah, that's what.
Maybe unprecedented as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Great shot there of the RCP leading the parade. Pretty incredible. With their distinctive lances and swords.
And look at that shot along the Mall. It is stunning.
We can see there that some of the members of the Canadian contingent, the 48th Highlanders, Calgary Highlanders, a number of contingents there, some of the British Army. These are all regiments with which the Queen had a personal connection, so she was probably the Royal Colonel or Colonel-in-Chief. Here, the Royal Air Force Regiment, once again marching with their arms reversed, which is fairly uncomfortable.
But a mark of respect. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah, I'd say.
And we're seeing regiments that people probably don't even realize in many cases or still exist or still perform some of these functions. Because you don't see them that often. So
That's right. These are all operational soldiers. They're soldiers first, and the ceremonial duties come as kind of a secondary duty for them. And of course, the household division here in London does a lot of ceremonial, but some of these regiments do it only occasionally. So this is a big deal for them.
And there are the bearskin hats. Correct me if I'm wrong. Coldstream Guards.
I think that may have been the Grenadier Guards, but the Coldstream Guards are on parade. All of the Guards regiments are on parade today in one form or another.
Prince George, and it looks like he's in.
And Princess Charlotte, is that, yes, they're riding along in the car, and I believe that was the Queen Consort.
And probably the Princess of Wales.
And the Princess of Wales. Middleton.
So for Prince William or the Prince of Wales children, their last name now changes to Wales. It was Cambridge, so we'll now all switch over to, he will be Prince George of Wales now, and she'll be Princess Charlotte of Wales. And I think you know, Brian, when Harry was in Afghanistan, his uniform said Harry Wales on the back of his shirt.
He talked about how much he loved that period in his life because he could just be a soldier and not a prince.
That's right. And I think the Queen had a similar experience, like I say, when she was living with the Duke of Edinburgh. Before really they were involved in all this, they lived as a couple, and she spoke about that as being one of the happiest times of her life, kind of a simple, normal existence before she had to take on the burden of being a queen.
Outside the fishbowl.
But even Prince William, when they first got married at Cape, they lived in Wales on base for that reason, to try to spend a year or two out of the spotlight and settle into marriage and public life, which I think was quite smart.
Look at that stunning view. RCMP front and center there leading this procession. hard to tell from here, but it seems the crowd is silent. It's a solemn moment for those people who have waited so long. Some people were camped out waiting for this, to be part of it. And there you can see Queen's 4 children, including King Charles, Prince Harry, and Prince William, the Prince of Wales.
And Princess Anne's husband is there as well, Tim Lawrence, and the second Earl of Snowdon, and Prince Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, the Queen's cousin.
And there you have a good shot of the wreath on top of the coffin. And a handwritten message on the wreath. It is from the King, the Queen's son, and it says, "In loving and devoted memory." And those flowers were cut from the gardens of Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Highgrove House. As you said, Brian, some chosen for their symbolism, such as rosemary for remembrance, English oak, which symbolizes the strength of love. There are scented blooms in there too. Garden roses and hydrangea and dahlias and touches of white, all of to reflect the royal standard on which the flowers sit. There's King Charles. They would have done this most recently, of course, for their father, whose funeral was last year. And they walked behind. It wasn't a state funeral, and it wasn't at Westminster, but it was a significant moment in their lives, losing their father, and they walked behind.
Well, they're losing both parents within sort of 15, 16 months, which a lot of people do experience in life. And Prince Philip was that every inch of that service was his. He wrote, what he did is what he wanted. I actually thought his was nice. Of all of them, I really liked the service and the way that they played everything out at Windsor Castle.
And that service was, sorry for interrupting, was that very sad moment when the Queen had to sit all by herself, respecting the rules about, social distancing through the pandemic. I can't imagine, had she died in the midst of that, how the Queen's funeral would have taken place. Because this is obviously such a moment where people just want to gather and want to be here.
Yes, and you wouldn't have been able to do that during COVID. So, it's the arch.
Brian, are they marching through the arch? This is Horse Guards, right? They'll be emerging.
Which is the official entrance to Buckingham Palace. And they're emerging now onto Horse Guards Parade, which is pointed because that's where the annual Queen's Birthday Parade takes place. Of course, it will be the King's Birthday Parade still held in June, because that's the official date, not the real date, chosen for its weather. But she had ridden the Arsene horse Burmese onto this parade square 18 times as the Colonel-in-Chief of the Guards Regiment, reviewing their troops. And she took a real personal interest in her military connections. Like I say, it's a military family. They have all served. She served, her husband served, her children have served, her grandchildren have served. And she's maintained that real personal connection to a lot of different branches, and we see that represented here today.
And you see so much symbolism. I mean, this started hundreds of years ago, before 24-hour news services and Twitter and TikTok. Because how else did you show people or your people unless you put it on display or marched or did parades? And then you wore stuff that was symbolic to others, so it meant something, whether it was a brooch or a pearl or what your hat was like, even in the women in their dress in particular. So it's now just come along with us, and here we are in 2022 watching something so extraordinary on TV.
That's right, and it is a personal occasion, and sort of the way you measure the connection is the proximity to the casket. And so you'll see that, next to the casket are the former equerries that the military that served the Queen. Immediately behind the casket are the members of royal family in their order of precedence. Surrounding the casket are the various bodyguards. You see right here the gentlemen at arms. We've seen the yeomen of the guard there in their distinctive uniforms with the flat hats. And we've also seen the Queen's Company of Archers, the Royal Company of Archers from Scotland, who are the Queen's bodyguard in Scotland and have traveled down here with the casket to be part of the process. And all of those units and others served during the lying in state. They actually did a vigil around the casket, and that was changed up every 20 minutes. But it was quite something. For days they stood there as Londoners and people from around the world filed past, and those enormous lines up to 14 hours in some cases. Even David Beckham had to stand in line for like 8 hours.
Yeah, I think it was actually more like 13, and he had no problem with it, as did everyone who said, we're happy. She reigned for 70 years. We can stand in line for a little bit.
Pretty spectacular. I understand it took 3 hours just to leave the line after you'd been through the procession.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I think they're turning onto Horse Guards Road, if I'm not mistaken, and you can see flags lining that. Those are the flags of the Commonwealth, including, of course, the Canadian flag.
And those equerry roles are so critically important. I mean, I was exposed to some of them when I worked in the Prime Minister's office, but just being a staff member with the Prime Minister for a long time, 8 years, I understand what those personal relationships are in a professional manner. Like, they are lifelong ties that bind you forever, because you have that unique experience of being. So if you were with the Queen, you're in a very small club. If you got to spend time with her on a daily basis and work with her and travel with her and write speeches and just the day-to-day workings that the Queen would have to do.
And they develop a very deep bond, and a lot of those members of the household get awarded the Royal Victorian Order. So you'll see some of those wearing those distinctions today.
And after this procession reaches the Wellington Arch and the coffin is put into the hearse, it moves to Windsor Castle, and part of the service at St. George's Chapel there will include members of the royal household. It will be their chance to pay their respects.
I think that's when you see this get really intimate.
Yes.
That's a family. It becomes a family affair at that point. This is the state portion of it, and when she finally gets to the chapel in Windsor, that becomes a family event.
I think 2,000 guests inside the Abbey behind us here, and 800 guests at St. George's Chapel, which is not an insignificant number. It's still big, but and then after that, the thing that we won't see is the private burial for the family.
And that'll probably be 150 people or so, because it'll be extended family, military, and their own family, and then all the Queens, maybe some of the royalty that's here from Europe, because they're all descendants of Queen Victoria, at least 4 of the families, right? So.
Interesting shot here of the heralds. It's their responsibility to kind of keep the lineage and protect a lot of the the heraldry and that sort of thing, which is kind of a visual CV, a visual resume of the aristocracy of Britain and of course the royal family. So they're the ones that preside over the proclamation of the new king, and they're prominent in today's parade.
Right, and that was when we saw the king proclaimed with the trumpets and all of that. That was exact. It seemed archaic in a way that we all knew he was the king, and yet they do that because it's tradition, and it was the way it was done before, right? When there were questions about succession, maybe it wasn't exactly clear who was going to be king, so they would proclaim.
And it's the heralds that are responsible for being the guardians of that. Very distinctive,
Uniforms.
livery. Yeah.
Livery, is that what it says? Is that the proper term?
Probably.
Yes.
And once again, it's kind of the royal standard, the Lions of England, the Lion Rampant of Scotland, and the Irish Harp. So I believe that's the General Officer Commanding London District, so the senior officer on parade here today.
city was really built for this, wasn't it? You look at it, and just think, the ceremony, the parades, it's majestic.
You're right, it's really built for that purpose. The long mall leading to Buckingham Palace.
Well, and just the statue, the circle with Queen Victoria, meant for crowds, right? Meant to allow people to come as close as they could.
Well, the last time we saw so many people here, of course, was for the Queen's Jubilee, which was just this summer.
2 months ago.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's hard to... That was such a time of celebration and joy, and seeing her on the balcony of Buckingham Palace there, and now seeing her coffin move past.
I would think, pardon the pun, but that would have been a crowning moment for her, to get to that Jubilee in June. And, you know, had lost her husband within, you know, a year of that. There comes a time maybe in life when you think, I've pretty much done all I can now, right? And I've done it all. And she was so well celebrated and honored at that time. Family is having a week following of mourning so that they can collect themselves after this and rest. I mean, the king will still have to work 7 days a week no matter what's going on, but to be able to just go home and have some privacy for a few days.
That is the car carrying the Queen Consort, Camilla. It's a little hard to see with through the windows there, but and the Princess of Wales. And see the two children, though. Yeah, Princess Charlotte and Prince George, I believe, are in that.
With her hat on.
And they're driving right behind the rest of the procession. And there is Countess of Wessex, is that right? Sophie?
Yeah.
And I believe I'm being told the other person in the car is Meghan, it should be, Meghan Markle.
Just in terms of protocol.
Yeah.
It should be. Because no matter what has happened, Prince Harry is still the son now of the sovereign. They're not just the grandchildren anymore. They're the sons of the sovereign, so their status changes a little bit.
And there is the interest in Eugenie, daughters of Prince Andrew.
It's incredible. The Queen, when she began her life, was not destined to be Queen. You know, she was, I think, about 14 when it became clear that her father would be king. And prior to that, it wasn't really, it wasn't the plan that she be queen. And so she came upon it, and must have been quite a life change. And I think that this branch of the royal family is very much shaped by those events.
Very much.
And you have to wonder if she was the queen she became because she was only 25 and took it quite seriously, you know, and took it on.
Her father passed fairly young, probably because of the burden of the job, and I think she was very aware of that. In her, sort of maiden speech, she says she's going to dedicate her life, be it long or short, because her father had passed so early.
Not everyone at 25 might handle it and step into it as she did, but she did from day one. So.
And you know something interesting, the Queen Consort Camilla released a video statement last night talking about the Queen and her memories of the Queen and the relationship with her. And as she pointed out, when she became Queen at that age, she was the sole woman in the sort of circles she had to inhabit, right? There were no women prime ministers, there were no women in positions of authority, and there she was. And she became, I think, a role model for so many women.
For sure. And her only other role model would have been Queen Victoria, like her grandmother. So, you know, just what she accomplished for women in any kind of professional public service is really quite remarkable.
I thought too about at the funeral and yesterday at Buckingham Palace, world leaders went to meet with the new king and other members of the royal family, and there's a reception after this as well. They'll all be mingling and meeting, and it's I wonder what level of if they think a little bit about their role, right, as leaders, and their moral authority, how they conduct themselves, if the Queen's life is any influence or example to the world today and political leaders today.
Well, coming from a political background, I certainly hope so. We've seen so much anger in politics in the last couple of years in Canada and the United States that hopefully her model of patience and listening and trying to make a difference will help our own political process. Not that, you know, most people that go into public life as politicians want to be good at what they do and represent their countries. So, and I still believe in that. But I do always hope for civil society in the sense of good people running public office that care about the democracy of our country.
Well, if they take one thing away, I hope it's this concept of servant leadership, you know, which is to say, it's not about them. You know, there's a lot of ego in politics, and you know, the Queen, it was never about her; it was about service, and that's, I think, the legacy that she leaves.
As Justin Welby, he said something to that effect right off the top of his sermon, which was that there's a pattern for leaders to be revered in life and forgotten in death, and to cling to power rather than sort of rise to the occasion, right? And
well, and her quiet diplomacy, right, and her quiet authority, because she had a lot of power, but she didn't have a lot of authority all the time. But she could guide her prime ministers and leaders of the realm and the Commonwealth, and she did so, and had a good relationship with quite a lot of them. That conversations that took place that people will never know about.
Because she would meet, and as the king will do, every week with the prime minister. Meetings that are not attended by anyone else, no notes are taken, they're not recorded. It's just a moment for the sovereign to speak freely with the prime minister. And a number of former prime ministers have said what wise counsel she was in her early years, but especially as she became older and she had this arc of history, right? There's just things that she had witnessed and lived through, and the people she had met, and the advice that she could offer as a result.
Yes, and you know, I don't know if Prime Minister Mulroney or former PM Mulroney will speak to it today, but certainly her guidance during apartheid and in South Africa while he was Prime Minister he has been telling that, making that tribute to her over the last few months, especially during the Jubilee. But she was a very quiet presence on phone calls and offering advice.
Interestingly, there's the kettle drums of Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment, the Blues and Royals, and the horse itself carries the rank of Major, if you can believe that. It's so senior. But it's quite something to see that they're in their state dress again, which is a mark of their connection to the household. You know, that state dress is hundreds of years old. It looks a little strange to see them as military on parade with a riding hat, but that's where it comes from. And you know, things are going to change. We have a new king, and so the it's the sovereign cipher. It's Queen Elizabeth's cipher they wear on their uniform today, but that will change to Charles III shortly.
Everything will be changing, I suppose. Stamps, money, letterheads, allegiance to the king for immigration and passports, and there's flags. It's going to take some time.
Queen's Council will become, I think it already has, King's Council.
Yeah.
Even God Save the King, it's going to be a little hard to transition to the new lyrics.
It's true. So for those of you just joining us, we are watching the procession after the state funeral for Queen Elizabeth II. It is moving through central London. The gun carriage being pulled by members of the Navy, senior members of the royal family, including King Charles, walking behind it. Other members of the family driving in the cars, you can see just behind it. And there's a beautiful shot as they head to Wellington Arch at High Park Corner. This is a 45-minute march, roughly, slow march. And there are people lining the route who have been waiting, some of them camped out to be there, to get a front row seat. Standing, of course, nobody's seated, to stand in the front row and watch this, be witness to this. Queen's coffin on a gun carriage, draped in the royal standard, the imperial state crown on the top, and the orb, and the mace. And on the very top, a wreath, or I guess a bouquet of flowers. And tucked in there is a note, which is from the king to his mother. The note says, "In loving and dedicated memory." As I watch this, I think about the millions, I'm sure it's millions, of people all over the world sitting on their couches at home, maybe with a cup of tea, watching this. We're privileged to be here in central London and have a close-up view. But this is a really global event, because the reach was global.
First head of the Commonwealth, clearly the longest serving head of the Commonwealth, which spans the globe. And many of those people are represented here today. We've seen the Canadian contingent mixed with the Australian and New Zealand troops. We have Fijians, we have Gurkhas from Nepal. It's quite a wide assortment of people from, and then of course, the representative of government. I think there's over 180 heads of state or heads of government that are represented here today. It's a virtual United Nations here today.
And the last state funeral in this country was for Winston Churchill. Some time ago.
Yeah, it must clearly speak to how people appreciate steady leadership. Somebody that she's been there through everything for people for 70-some years, and they have clearly looked to her for some symbol of hope, you know, and that things will be okay. And I think that that's quite remarkable that she was able to accomplish that. And, you know, because we keep hearing about the monarchy, what is it, why do we need it? And yet you look at this outpouring, so something's been going right about it and something's worked. And for those of us that have been associated with the Commonwealth, there is a lot of good work that goes on all the time in terms of educating young people and providing homes and safety and security issues and even in some cases environmental, water, just simple things. But that work goes on every day around the globe. And so it's people are, at least they're paying attention to what this is and what this woman meant to the world and to the citizens of the world. The role that she's played is almost unmatchable, I think. And we all three know we will never see this again, ever.
And I don't think there is anyone alive today who could command the love and respect and the crowds that we're witnessing today.
That's right. And I mean, part of the Queen's legacy is that sense of dignity that she had and her gentleness. When it was with world leaders or walking through a crowd, she was able to bring herself to the level that people she was talking to. It's an incredible skill, and that will certainly be missed.
And you know, when a country's going through a funeral like this, the country doesn't look like it's in flux, because this is reassuring when you see that these traditions and, you know, parades and tributes have continued on, and you now have a new king. So part of this is a healing process, but it's also to assure its citizens that things are in hand and that the country is okay.
And let's face it, this country is going through some upheaval. It's gone through how many prime ministers in the last couple of years, and through Brexit, and there are a lot of people struggling financially, and energy costs are going up, and so there are people who say, why are we doing this and spending so much money on this?
Well, who's going to pay my heating bill?
Yes, yes, and it's a fair question, and it's also a fair question to ask, what's the future of the monarchy, right? Should this continue? And I can't imagine that anyone in the royal family thinks that it's a given things will stay the same, because the monarchy is constantly changing and adapting, right? And the Queen was the first to have her coronation televised, right? Is it her coronation or a wedding? I can't remember which one now.
It was a wedding.
I think yeah? I can't remember. I feel like I should know these details. But that was Prince Philip who advocated for that. I think it was
Maybe it was the coronation.
Queen was the first queen to go to a pub. Very incredible, really. It's an honor to go to a pub. You know, I think that's kind of quintessentially British, but she was the first to do that. And so, you know, she was definitely a queen of the people.
I'm told it was the coronation was the first televised event. And this will be the first fully televised in every detail state funeral.
I'm sure that King Charles has already prepared himself for what's coming with the monarchy within the Commonwealth, and I would think that there'll be more conversations, rethinking, and maybe a reframing of the relationship. Like they may have to, maybe they stay associated with the Commonwealth, but they're separate. So I think there'll be a lot of work done in the next 2 to 3 years, and he'll have to lead most of that and be prepared for it, which I would be highly surprised if he's not. So, because you know he had a lot of tete-a-tetes and meetings with heads of the realm and our Prime Minister, as they all were here for the funeral, and they would have probably started some discussions about what's to come.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Charles has prepared his whole life for this role, and met, as you say, many world leaders and traveled widely, incredibly widely, representing the Queen all over the world.
Well, the thing he did smartly is professionalize the role of the Prince of Wales, because it hadn't always been considered a role of seriousness in the past. in some cases, that he was in the job for a long time.
Sort of, and maybe just sit and wait for
Right.
to become king. That's not what he did.
That's not what he did. He went about his business in terms of the environment and a lot of issues and public policy issues that he actually cares deeply about. And he made the Duchy of Cornwall, this property that he owns, quite successful. And it carries a lot of members of the royal family, the monies that come through that foundation, through the farm and the lands and the estate. And then he just got busy, you know, he made it into a much more practical role and a real true job that helped serve the Queen and fulfilled roles that she couldn't always do, and then gave himself a presence. Because I think at some point, if you're 25 and you become the Prince of Wales, you've got to think about your life. And so that I give him a lot of credit for.
And the Prince's Trust was another thing that he started that was so helpful to so many people's lives, again, all over the Commonwealth.
This concept of a small group of working royals is something that really came into its own during Queen Elizabeth's reign. And you're right that the Prince of Wales was very much at the forefront of that. A small group of members of the family that were actively doing royal tasks around the kingdom and around the world, right? So it's proven to be a very good model. Of course, you know, some members have decided to leave that model.
Well,
so
and that is the challenge. If you're the heir, it's different than if you're the second, third, fourth in line, right? Then it's perhaps a little harder to find a role for yourself. And that's what we've witnessed in this family.
I think that's the household staff at Buckingham Palace. They're kind of an honor guard.
That's right. We're watching as the casket passes Buckingham Palace, and all of her staff from the palace are out front lined up, paying their respects as the cortege goes past. And soon, now they're turning to go up past Green Park. And as I mentioned before, there's a significant memorial there to the Canadians who fell in the World Wars, which is in Green Park, so that the cortege will pass that as well, and then ultimately go through Commonwealth Arch on its way to Commonwealth Gate, rather, on its way to Wellington Arch. So there's a lot of symbolism. You know, here we are in the center of London, but there's a lot of symbolism that roots into Canada. I mean, I like to think of that memorial as being kind of Canadian, sacred Canadian soil here in London.
Yeah, the household staff of the palace is quite moving, isn't it? Because they are people who toil away behind the scenes, right? But probably knew the Queen in a way the rest of us never could have.
Oh, they would know her better than most, right? Because you were with them in their most, you know, down moments. And
I know that there were also many stories of the Queen and Prince Philip when they were on their own, not wanting any of the finery, and you know, they like to have their breakfast with the little radio on and have their cereal in Tupperware containers and sit and have a cup of tea and just, you know, sort of get on with things and have moments where they were separate from all of this pageantry and all of the trappings that go with being queen.
Well, it's easy to lose track of it in these moments, but they're people. They're just people like us, ultimately, and they have those needs that we have to live a simple life.
Yeah.
well, and being through World War II, right? Most people seem to have carried on traditions. I don't know about your parents, but my father was a World War II vet, and there was a lot of Tupperware and things being saved, right?
Yes,
So
saving everything, yes.
And lights always turned off, and you know, there was no waste of anything.
Yeah, some of the most moving moments were the corgis. You know, the Queen was a fan of corgis, and you know, there's a scene of them being put on a helicopter, being brought back from Scotland, and it's those sort of human moments where you see, you know, she passes away, but who's going to take care of the dogs?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I think Prince Andrew took them, is my understanding.
That's what I've heard too, and that the King doesn't have corgis, but he has Jack Russells. He loves Jack Russells, and I think he and the Queen Consort have 2, I've read, and both rescue dogs.
Wow.
Yeah. So we'll see maybe a different fleet of canines.
Well, it's interesting that, you know, we were talking about the bouquet earlier. very symbolic. But one of the things about it is it was made in a sustainable way, which of course is one of the king's personal priorities. So.
Yes, he was talking about sustainability and environmentalism and, you know, overuse of plastic long before it was popular. In fact, he has said people thought he was weird and crazy, right? When he taught, yes, that it was crazy to think about starting an organic farm, which is what he did, that would never work. Why would you even bother with that? Turns out he was ahead of his time.
Well, and even when you went into Green Park, they had people there taking the plastic off the flowers to dispose of it separately. So there's been a lot of money spent on flowers in London in the last 10 days. Like, it's extraordinary. And it's in Green Park now, it's in its own area, and they're piled high.
There were a lot of Paddington bears too being left there, and marmalade sandwiches until the palace people put out a notice saying, please could you stop leaving Paddington bears and marmalade sandwiches. One, the sandwiches just attract vermin, and two, Paddington bears, they can't be recycled. Right? But it was a sweet nod to that moment we saw again at the Jubilee, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
They were trying to encourage people to donate to the charities versus buying flowers. But the whole process of buying the flower and taking it to Green Park has been meaningful for a lot of people. Like, it's part of, you know, they didn't all stand in line to see her lying in state, so this was their way of sort of addressing it, I think, for themselves. So
I went and looked at those flowers, and my favorite card that I saw was someone had drawn a picture of the Queen as if she was ascending the gates to heaven, and all the corgis were coming to meet her.
that is wonderful.
Well, and this royal family has a very close connection to the outdoors. I mean, you know, Queen unfortunately died in Balmoral, but that's the family summer home, and they go there.
Loved it there.
Right, they love the being outdoors. You know, she was a gifted equestrian, and she loved going for walks in the Highlands of Scotland, and as you say, the King Charles III, well, he effectively ran a farm, you know, and did a great job at marketing those products and you know, paying attention to that. So there's a sustainability aspect that runs through the family lineage, and you know, when we talk about Buckingham Palace being the royal office and Windsor being the home, and but they do like to spend time in the country as much as they can. You know, there's great, you know, always those great shots of the Queen in a Barber jacket and Wellington boots, you know, rubber boots. So they're passing Green Park now, and the memorial is just out of sight of the camera, but it's right there. Great shot there of the equerries, the former military staff that supported the Queen. Tata, the first black man to serve as an equerry, a personal friend of mine. You can see there's, you know, these people that hold that job tend to do fairly well in the army afterwards, and they're all very senior now.
Brian, what does an equerry do?
They're the liaison between the military and the monarch. But they, you know, functionally they do a lot of the sort of preparatory work. So, for example, you know, we may have seen coverage of you know, Prime Minister Trudeau coming to visit the King. Well, it was an equerry who introduces him, who escorts him in and makes sure that it's all arranged. But they're really the monarch's right hand, and they fulfill an essential role, and they develop a very close personal relationship. You know, Tata has a great sense of humor. He's from Ghana, actually, and you know, you often see him, even in public, was laughing with the Queen and that sort of thing. It's incredible to see it. Very, very close relationship there.
So very difficult day for all of them too, for him.
It is. It's personal to these people.
Yes.
You know, they had a personal connection, and we see now that the guns of the King Street Royal Horse Artillery, they're firing a salute in Green Park. They do that on a number of occasions every year, but of course this was special. They're firing one round for every year of the Queen's life. This is King Street Royal Horse Artillery is founded by a member of the royal family to make sure that the Royal Artillery had a role in ceremonial. So they participate in the Queen's birthday parade, and they stand guard at horse guards and that sort of thing.
Didn't
Princess Anne's husband? Wasn't he equerry to the Queen at one point? Yeah.
Speaking of Princess Anne, she issued a statement this week too and said that she was, I wonder if she used the word honored or privileged to spend the last 24 hours of the Queen's life with her mother. She was at Balmoral. And she is, after the Queen, the hardest working royal, right? She has attended so many events, has been so kind of following quietly in her mother's footsteps. Not being the heir, but her sense of duty really learned from her mother.
Well, no nonsense, princess. Goes about her job, goes about her business, gets it done. And I think in many ways probably the one child of the Queen that is, I'm not going to say the most reliable, but just, the daughter, and so the one that you develop a different kind of relationship with, and would have been special to both her parents, like being the only girl, but, and takes no nonsense off of her brothers either. And so I think she kind of keeps them all in line. She's pretty much the keeper of the status quo, right? And interferes and then doesn't. Like, I think she just tries to keep it all smooth, and she's good children. She's got great, her daughter and son have turned out to be pretty good people and good citizens as well, and contributing. So, but she would have been close to her mother because they were all literally horse people, right?
Yes.
So that had a lot to do with it.
Yes, she was very, very close, right? They shared so much. Oh, this is what she said. I was fortunate to share the last 24 hours of my dearest mother's life, and it's been an honor and a privilege to accompany her on her final journeys. Witnessing the love and respect shown by so many on these journeys has been humbling and uplifting.
Well, it's wonderful that she was in Scotland and that she could be there, because my understanding is that in the end the Queen went quickly, or much faster than they were expecting. So, which happens, right? It happens.
That is something I was thinking about earlier today, is that we saw her on a Tuesday with Liz Truss, and the day before with the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and on Thursday she passed away. And she was working right up until the very end. Again, that's duty and service. And she also didn't suffer a prolonged illness
Which is a blessing.
difficult death. It is a blessing.
It's a blessing. I think she suffered enough with her knees and her ankles, and she had a lot of arthritic pain and bad knees, and that's quite painful. And the older you get, the more painful and more difficult it is. So, and that's why she didn't do a lot of the journeys or go anywhere anymore, because of the mobility issues.
I think Prince Charles, now King Charles, was also at Balmoral very quickly.
Yes.
He and Camilla, because I believe they were up in Scotland.
They were there.
They weren't at Balmoral. I
No,
don't
they
think
were at their own estate.
Right.
I think the Queen had quite a fondness too, though, for the new Queen consort, for Camilla, who's been quite a key member of the royal family for 15, 18 years now.
It wasn't always so. That's for sure.
No, and it wasn't easy to become.
No. The wife of Charles.
No.
The second wife of
Yes.
Charles. Yeah.
And she never used the title Princess of Wales, which she was entitled to. She chose to be the Duchess of Cornwall, just for the boys, and to make it smoother, make it easier. Just even politically, it was just.
But she could never replace Princess Diana. That was, yeah. But the Queen made a point of making her Queen consort, of announcing that she would take on that role, right? Which was a sign of how much she had come to accept and love
Yes.
her.
And and she works hard. She worked hard at it, and you know, Camilla was more of them. If you know what I mean, she understood kind of what the royal life was like, and she just kind of slid into it quite easily. And then she took hold of it, and the British press that traveled with them really liked being on tour with Prince Charles, and Camilla was with him. You know, because she's funny, and she's, you know, she likes to have a good laugh, and she works hard, and she's very decent in terms of information to media about events and sharing things that happened and not being closed up. And I think they really started to admire her for that.
Well, there we can see Wellington Arch, and a lot of the contingents have now formed up there. Of course, we're part of that procession, and they finished their part. I was speaking with some Canadians last night. They've got a great spot. They're right where the casket will be transferred from the gun carriage into the hearse. So they just kind of lucked out. But the reception the Canadians have received here has been really, really spectacular. Right from, you know, the RCMP who are riding horses that they gifted but are part of the Royal Stables, Royal Mews, and you know, the Canadian troops that are on parade here have been very well taken care of. And they were telling me about that last night. They're really, really thrilled with the reception they've received and feel that they've been honored in a very respectful way. And one of the other things they commented on was that, you know, that they're now working with these household division troops that do ceremonial all the time, and you know, they take it personally. I keep using that word in this commentary. It is personal, but these are troops that are so close, used to being with the Queen or being around the Queen, guarding her, and you know, they have embraced these other contingents. But for them, it is very personal.
And when the coffin reaches this point, it will be loaded into the hearse, and then make the drive to Windsor Castle. As you pointed out, Brian, a slow drive. It's not going to be.
That's right. They're not taking the highway, the motorway. They're taking a regular road that's going to kind of wind its way to Windsor through a number of different communities, enabling people to pay their respects along the way. So this is obviously the formal part in downtown London, but you know, the whole procession continues to giving people the opportunity to pay their respects.
Same as what they did when Mari left Balmoral and went to Edinburgh. They took the long route, right? They took the coastal roads, and
people did come out in droves, you know, to watch. It's very symbolic that this parade finishes at Wellington's Arch. You know, the Duke of Wellington was who led the British Army to victory at the Battle of Waterloo, you know, quite a few years ago now, but a very significant figure in British history, and it's very significant that it ends at his arch.
And this will end this part of the march of the senior royals, including the king, behind the coffin. They'll be driven the rest of the route, but I believe they will be walking again.
That's right.
At Windsor.
The Royal Mile in Windsor, which is quite always
it's long.
It's long.
The long mile.
The long mile. Where they'll be walking. I think it's more than a mile. Actually.
Yeah.
It's a long walk.
It's 3 miles.
Is that right?
It is.
Long
It's
mile, right?
very long. And this procession, the funeral ended when we expected it would. It was about an hour long. This has all taken a little bit longer. I guess it's very difficult to time a slow march. We don't really know. So I think we were expecting this transfer of the coffin to the state hearse about 24 minutes, 25 minutes ago. So maybe they will speed up the drive a little bit to Windsor then, just to keep that portion.
Yeah, there we are, just coming through Wellington Arch right now.
Magnificent.
This part of London is right in the heart of the city, right near Hyde Park. I've gone through there so many times myself on the bus or on the tube or walking through there, and it's such a busy hustle bustle kind of place, as the city always is. Today, that's all changed. Today it's such a solemn, crowds are quiet. It's everyone recognizing this moment in history.
In this shot, you can make out the Duke of Wellington's residence, where the Duke still lives, in fact, number 1 London, Apsley House. So just another, nod to the history. So the Canadian contingent is actually kind of at the front of the line of troops you see there, formed up in front of the casket. They're just sort of at the bottom left of the screen.
When they are all formed up, you realize how many there were in this procession.
Incredible. Like I say, it's unprecedented since the funeral of Winston Churchill. Duke of Edinburgh's funeral or Margaret Thatcher's funeral, either were smaller affairs. This is a proper state funeral, which is a lot different.
And there you see Camilla and Prince George, Princess Charlotte. They've gotten out of their vehicles. And Princess of Wales. The sun has come out, but it's still just a little bit of wispy cloud, so it's not a baking hot day that you can sometimes get in this city, right? Which is a relief for all these people in full uniform, and for the royals themselves who are
And the crowds.
walking so far, and the crowds
It's made it a nice, comfortable day for them
to be outside. Yeah.
and to be quiet, right? Just to watch, because that would be pretty special to see.
Very.
It's a blessing.
Brian, can you remind us again what uniforms the King is wearing, what the heir to the...
Yeah, the King is wearing uniform of the Admiral of the Royal Navy. It's interesting, he's wearing a number of decorations, one of which is the Canadian decoration for long service with a number of bars, because he's been in that role for a long time. And the Prince of Wales is wearing his Royal Air Force uniform, because he served as a pilot, a Sea King pilot in the Royal Air Force. And I didn't quite enjoy the job. He had to leave it because it's a little dangerous at times, but he famously landed it in some pretty dangerous circumstances.
I think he also flew at one time to Kate Middleton's family home, which was when he was
Early in the court.
yeah, so really when he was courting her, which was frowned upon, but very popular for Kate, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
Showing up in a helicopter
Yeah.
has an effect.
And a uniform.
Prince Harry, too, of course, out of all of them, is the one who actively served in recent memory.
Yes, he did. He was deployed to Afghanistan as an Apache helicopter pilot, so an attack helicopter pilot, or as a gunner, I'm afraid. So he was a member of the Army Air Corps there and deployed actively. There's a famous interview that he did where he had to get up in the middle and leave because he's been called to go into action. So pretty dramatic. I mean, you get that opportunity when you're not the direct heir. You can expose yourself to a little more risk. Prince William served, domestically, but wasn't allowed to deploy overseas. And I remember the first time Harry went to Afghanistan, he he had to get pulled back
Yes.
because they felt that he was exposed to too much risk.
Yes, it had been leaked that he was there, I think, and they had to get him out because they were afraid for his safety. But he did talk about that as being, as we were speaking about earlier, the happiest time in his life, because he could be a regular soldier and not a prince. And I think that's, that's something he's continuing to deal with in his life, right? And has now chosen not to be a working royal. He's moved to the United States. But that, his relationship with the rest of the royals, his relationship with his brother and his father is still, safe to say, work in progress.
I would say it's a work in progress. So we do know he has a book coming out in the fall, so there's anticipation about what that will be and what it will say. Maybe it'll be fine, I don't know, but it does have them worried.
Yeah.
They can't, they've taken so many hard hits in the last couple of years about, family and reputation that I think they're kind of hoping that they can move past some of that and do the work that they're trying to do. And that has, damaged relationships with some of the realms of the Commonwealth as well. So, and with Canada with such a presence in this funeral service,
Oh, there's...
there they are.
Yeah, Charlotte and Princess Charlotte and Prince George. We've been told, sorry to interrupt, Bonnie, we've been told that they were going to march behind. They obviously made a decision not to do that. It's a long, long way for those two, who are, I think, 7 and 9, but clearly very present at key moments in this service for their great-grandmother. And there's the coffin of Her Majesty the Queen being taken off the gun carriage and loaded into the hearse. It's an old coffin, lead lined, so very heavy.
I don't know if you could hear it earlier, but you could just make out the boatswain's call from the Royal Navy, signal again of respect. And then the gun carriage is taken away by the Royal Navy as the coffin is transferred into the hearse.
Another, what I imagine, slightly stressful moment for the pallbearers to do this transfer very carefully, respectfully.
Yeah, they will have done a lot of training for this, but it'll be amongst the most stressful things they ever do, I'm
Right.
sure.
Of course, the imperial state crown still perched on the top of the coffin.
Well, that will stay there until the service inside at Windsor, and then it will go to the King.
Yeah, so some of these troops that are pallbearers here today, they only came back from Iraq a week ago, and they got pulled back and sent to practice for this, so it's quite a transition for them. One of the officers there is only recently commissioned from Sandhurst. These are all members of the Queen's Company, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, and later on today it may become the King's Company, it'll be by proclamation, but it's still until she is interred, it is still Queen's custody.
And once they're sure that's all secure and the doors closed, then it will begin the drive to Windsor Castle. And the next phase in the day's events, which is the committal service at St. George's Chapel. King Charles and the Queen Consort looking on. Just as the hearse is about to leave, the bells of Westminster Abbey have begun to peal. There's a team of, I believe it's 10 volunteer bell ringers who again have practiced this, and it's just such a glorious sound to accompany this moment. Applauding, cheering along the route,
And throwing flowers, which is another tradition that they
people throwing flowers. We're here at Westminster Abbey. If you can hear the bells behind me, that's what you're hearing, because that's where we are sitting. This procession now in the hearse is headed to West London on its way to Windsor Castle. The King and the other members of the royal family following behind in those vehicles.
The ring of the flowers reminds me of Princess Diana's funeral procession as well, where the hearse at one point had to pull over to take the flowers off the windshields. There was so many. That was the first time I actually where I really witnessed that at that level.
barracks on the left as they're heading up.
And this whole route is lined with people who knew that this would be happening and tried to get a place as early as they could in the day. Barriers were set up all the way along this a couple of days ago in anticipation of the huge crowds.
It's why the design of the hearse the way it is, with the open window and the height and a bit of light in it, so you can actually see the coffin going by. It's a Jaguar, I think it's made by Jaguar, and I think it was actually quite a smart thing. If you're going to do a funeral like this, then you need to have a hearse that can actually show people, that show that your standard, the flag, and everything.
Escort, of course, but something that's remarkable given the scale of this event, security necessary, is that people are, you can see police standing there, but people are about as close as you can possibly be to witness this event.
Yeah, and Great Britain still has an unarmed police force. You know, so it's really incredible. I mean, they have armed teams available, but all those lobbies you see in their distinctive outfits, they're all unarmed. And in fact, to support this effort, there's been police brought in from jurisdictions around Great Britain. So it's not just London Metropolitan London Police on patrol today. It's all kinds of police from all over. It's truly a national effort.
And their orders would be, of course, to keep things safe, but let people see. Right?
Absolutely. It's, those two, security and access, go hand in hand. If you have good security, you can permit good access. So that's what's happening. I mean, there's the inner cordon, which you see here now, but there's also an outer cordon. So there's screening mechanisms, metal detectors, and that sort of thing in place, barriers in place so that vehicles can't get through. So it's a very cleverly thought through plan, which has been, it's an evergreen plan. So it's been coordinated all the time. It's constantly in evolution. It's interesting because the head of the Metropolitan Police, the lobbies, Scotland Yard, as we know it, is just in post recently.
Yeah.
He actually was put into post
Last week, I
That's
think.
right, exactly. So he is ultimately responsible for this, and he's only been on the job a week, so that's pretty incredible.
Imagine him watching this today, right? He just must be a little tense. But I mean, we have heard of nothing, and all the crowds that I was in this past week are completely respectful.
Very respectful, and you just see how deep they are. I mean,
Yes.
It's incredible. I mean, this is very poignant because they're heading up now toward the Albert Memorial, which and Prince Albert was Queen Victoria's consort, and of course across from that the Royal Albert Hall. So this is an area of London that's very significant. Where we can see it now, very significant to the royal family.
Queen Victoria had that built for Prince Albert because she went into mourning after he died and never came out of mourning.
That's right. Well, that's why we see Queen Victoria often in black, because she's still in mourning for her husband. She quite liked it.
There's Royal Albert Hall.
That's beautiful. And Albert and Victoria have been symbolic to members of the royal family as well because of the marriage and the relationship and the work that they did. I mean, he died about 20 years after they were married, 8 children or 9, I think. So he had a huge impact on further things that they did with museums and arts and culture around the city.
I find the Victorian era fascinating. One of the things important about Queen Victoria was that when she came into power as a monarch, it had a real political role. I mean, she was making real-time political decisions. And in her reign, it transitioned to the monarchy we have today, which is a ceremonial, effectively a ceremonial monarchy. And here we are turning into Kensington.
They were Albert and Victoria were partners, so even she was the queen, but he was very much involved in almost every decision that she made. And they used to have a partner's desk in their den where they actually sat facing each other all the time. Because in the beginning, he was
bit of lightness, right? They love to laugh, and they would, and he had a good sense of humor, and he would always make her laugh.
Have a little gin, you know, I mean, that's why they all love their country estates as well, because that's real escape for them. They can go out on the weekends and have their friends over, and it's private, and they can let their hair down a little bit. And
It's surprisingly informal, you know. It's like
absolutely.
out doing riding or walking in the mud and the rain, and that's what they love.
Because many people have gone to any of their estates for a Saturday night dinner completely overdressed, right? Because they'll show up in their cords and a shirt or something, and you're almost in a ball gown. You think, okay, you know, I need to leave.
All right, as we watch the procession make its way through Kensington now in London, on its way to Windsor Castle, where the service of committal will take place in St. George's Chapel. Let's go to Crystal Financing, who is in Windsor. Crystal.
Donna, the service of committal is expected to get going at 4 p.m. local time. That is 11 a.m. Eastern. And as you continue to see the route being lined with people, that is exactly what you should expect as the state hearse gets closer to Windsor. People have been lining up, the route has been mapped out, and it should be noted that the difference with Windsor Castle is that it is directly in the middle of town. So people here feel a very close relationship with the royals. They are literally neighbors, and so many people lining the route, waiting to say their goodbye to the Queen. Now, the state hearse is expected to come down the long walk and enter Windsor Castle. Members of the royal family will be in the quadrangle. They will meet the state hearse there, and then you will see yet another procession, a beautiful, well-orchestrated procession with family members walking behind Her Majesty's coffin, going to St. George's Chapel, and then stopping at the West Steps. As we've seen throughout this day at different minutes during the ceremonies, we will again see small little details that have been orchestrated by Her Majesty, details that she wanted to see at her funeral. And one of those will be the fact that some of the music will be played will be from Sir William Henry Harris, and he served as the organist at St. George's Chapel from when the Queen was a child, from 1933 to 1961. And Donna, it's believed that he's actually the person who taught the young princess at the time how to play piano. So these beautiful, small, personal moments will continue to play out throughout the day, and we will be able to see all of these moments as it will be televised from inside St. George's Chapel. If you remember from Prince Philip's funeral, the chapel is beautiful, very elegant, the long windows, the thin pillars, and that will all add to this element of the committal ceremony. Members of the realm, the prime ministers of the realm, will also be present, as will governors generals, and then we will see the moment that the coffin is low.
Ew. No. Oh, raining.
His tour was dealing with Indigenous communities, and that really kind of struck me. The attention was put on, which I think very rightly so. Those two things, and I gotta say, the music. Can we talk about the Renata? It's just beautiful. Yeah, I love it. And I gotta say, Rufus Wainwright, not Hallelujah by that account. I love it. Not the most traditional thing you do at a service like this, but it worked. It is Canada. It is
is and a great Canadian song. Actually, in our notes from Heritage Canada, they know the meaning that Leonard Cohen gave that song when he once described it. People said, what is it about? You're using the term hallelujah. It doesn't seem to be religious. It's both a sad song and a strong song. And he said, this world is full of conflicts and full of things that cannot be reconciled. But there are moments when we can reconcile and embrace the whole mess. And that is what I mean by hallelujah. What a perfect song, not a hymn for our times.
It is. And it struck me because for all that we talk about the Queen, and everyone has their iconic image of the Queen, she was a deeply religious woman. She believed very strongly in the oath that she took on her coronation. And there was something that the Archbishop of Canterbury said at the funeral earlier today. And he was referencing back to the vow that she took, the famous vow when she was 21, 1947. And she vowed that her whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be dedicated to your service. And he said, rarely has such a promise been so well kept. And it is a vow she took deeply. And Adrienne Clarkson referenced it when she talked about being at Sandringham, and the Queen just out of the blue said, I'm not going to abdicate. And Adrienne Clarkson was like, well, I wouldn't expect you would. But I mean, it's always been kind of in the back of mind as she got older. But they had foreseen what might happen. And quite frankly, the fact that the Queen did the last duties just 2 days before she died, it doesn't surprise me. I don't think it surprised a lot of people, because she was going to just keep going until she could no longer.
Really, really remarkable to serve literally until you die in the role. I know some folks were saying in those photographs of her that 2 days before she passed away, when she met with the new Prime Minister of Britain, you could see the bruises on her hands. Some were suggesting that might have been that she was getting IVs, but just incredible duty to her job, and pride and joy in it, that she seemed to really have so much wisdom to share with people, and I think that's something we've been talking about. I do want to go to our chief political correspondent, David Aiken, who is outside of Christchurch as this processional makes its way out. David, I'm sure you can see them coming out below you there, people starting to empty out of the church. Take us to the scene where you are.
Yeah, they're emptying out into worsening weather. The rain has largely abated for the last hour and a half or so when they came in, but I'm looking west down the Ottawa River right now, and a front is on the way. The rain has really just commenced. So they're leaving the church, and speaking of anthropomorphism, the weather is weeping for the Queen right now. It's raining and it's kind of cool. And it's interesting to hear Patricia Treble talk about what struck her about the service. I felt the same way, and you may well have as well, Mercedes, and I suspect many viewers, the eclecticism of that particular service, the diversity of it. A former refugee who became Governor General, that's Adrienne Clarkson, speaking about some of that in her address. And again, the very significant component, Indigenous component. Patricia mentioned Albert de Mont's address, where he talked about the horrors, that's the word he used, committed by British monarchs over the years, and then he spoke almost immediately about the empathy and the gentleness of Elizabeth and how that helped advance that file. We listened to music by Thompson Highway, and Thompson Highway and two other musicians. Thompson Highway, the Indigenous playwright, born in northern Manitoba, his first language was Cree, and here he is performing one of his songs at the memorial service for a British monarch. And of course, Brian Mulroney's address was significant as well, reminding that Canada does do some of its best work in partnership with people like the monarch to try and fight apartheid. So for me, just a remarkable service, so eclectic, so diverse. And finally, Mercedes, just the other thing too, and you may have thought about this, perhaps any leader in the entire world, she recognizes the contribution that Canadians made to world peace, to our armed forces. I mean, she must have spoken to tens of thousands of veterans over the time she was in office, all over the world. She really understood how Canada contributed to the things that we like to think we contribute to. Rule of democracy, rule of law, human rights. I think that's one of her most significant legacies as a Canadian.
Absolutely, and remarkable hearing former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney recount her talking about coming home to Canada. She, of course, made more trips to Canada than to any other country, so we can feel a little bit special there. Certainly, as you pointed out, a remarkable understanding and affinity for those in the armed forces. She didn't just see the job as Commander-in-Chief of being something that was ceremonial. It was something that she took very seriously. She seemed to enjoy connecting with the troops. I know I've talked to many who very much enjoyed connecting to her. And it struck me that, you know, a lot of these veterans who I know and have the honor of chatting with, who are pretty tough, sometimes salty folks, were deeply moved and grieving by the death of the Queen. They felt a very strong connection to her. They felt understood by her and respected by her, and it has certainly struck them. David, this now concludes the ceremony here. I know that leaders will continue to think about the legacy the Queen leaves, but there's also the discussion of how things change in Canada now in terms of renaming things. Take us through just sort of a brief sense of what this all means for us in governance. Our parliamentary democracy stays, that doesn't change, but some of the key names will.
That's right. Of course, we were talking about this in military. On every military dress uniform, it's a button that says E.R., Elizabeth Regina, and that's going to have to change that to C.R. or something else, Charles Rex. Who knows? Just little things like that. There will be some significant changes. We have heard that, you know, what's on our money is not going to change very quickly. Normally, Canada Post issues a stamp at the end of every year with Queen Elizabeth's pictures on it. I happen to be a stamp collector. I've got them all for the last 70 years. We're going to see a new stamp. That will be new, presumably coming out this year. But as Prime Minister Trudeau told our colleague Abigail Beeman in London this week, I don't think there'll be substantial changes. People may want to talk about our relationship here and there, but I think that's going to take a significant amount of time. For now, it's, well, as the Prime Minister said, we have the rock that is the monarchy upon which our constitutional democracy is built, and we have many other things, inflation, cost of living, that may occupy governments and other politicians of the day.
David, thank you so much for your coverage today and for joining us from Christchurch Cathedral on this historic occasion.
And here comes the rain.
Here comes the rain, and for our viewers at home, today in Ottawa feels a lot more like late November or February. Remarkable. We don't typically see this kind of very, very dark weather in the early afternoon and rain here. It's cold. It is a fitting day to say goodbye to a queen. Our Mike Armstrong has followed the memorial parade route this afternoon, and he has come to the steps of Christchurch Cathedral. You've been talking to Canadians, Mike, as they follow the parade. What are you hearing from people about why they've chosen to come down to try to be a part of today's ceremony?
Yeah, I mean, people just wanted, as you say, they wanted to be a part of it. They wanted to remember somebody. I just spoke to a couple, and they said it's the only queen we've known our entire life. They wanted to be here. They were also sort of overwhelmed with pride because their son was taking part in the musical ride as one of the RCMP officers in that. I also spoke to, actually, where I'm standing right now, earlier, there was a couple that was here with their little corgi named Winston, and they watched the parade, the parade past them in the service. They actually apparently had a corgi parade yesterday here in Ottawa. But, you know, one of the things it's hard not to be struck by is the fact that as somebody who was going to be stationed outside, I've been watching the weather for a couple of days, and it didn't look good. The weather was almost perfect for the whole service. The rain held off. Now that it's over, the skies seem to be opening up. And I don't think anybody's complaining because it held off right to the last minute.
Well, thank you so much for being out there. We're watching people walk in the pouring rain on this day when we say goodbye to Queen Elizabeth. Thank you to all of our guests who joined us throughout the program, including our royal expert, Patricia Trouble. We leave you now with a last look at some of the most poignant moments from today's final goodbye to Queen Elizabeth II. Thank you for joining us.
by experience. The trusted source that more Canadians are turning to for their news.
This is a residential neighborhood where they're still rescuing people.